Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you to everyone for joining our session today on head injuries and the use of helmets. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Carly Forrest. I'm a partner here at Brodie's in the Insurance and Risk team, and I'm joined today by my colleague Gemma Nicholson, who's a senior associate in the team, and we're both delighted to be joined by Dr John Camplin, who is a principal associate with Hawkins. And he's been there since 2005 and has a number of years' experience in the field of forensic engineering investigation. So thanks, John, for joining us today. John's got an honours degree in chemical physics, a doctorate in surface chemistry, and he's also a member of the Institute of Physics. And today, John is going to talk to us about the types of helmet available and the protection afforded by those helmets, as well as looking at the tolerance of the head to impact. And I think as lawyers and insurers, it's an issue we come across time and time again, whether that's in relation to cycling, skiing, quad bike accidents, to name but a few. I've certainly had many arguments over the years with opponents and in court about what deduction ought to be made from a pursuer's damages where a helmet hasn't been worn at all or it's not been worn properly. And it raises a number of really interesting questions for us on the causation and contributing negligence side. And I think with that, I will pass over to you, John, to get started.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Carly. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully my talk today is going to show you something you didn't know already. It's really an overview, I would say, rather than in-depth technical treatment of helmets and head injuries, but sometimes that's what you need to sort of assess cases as they come in. Okay, so we'll move straight along. He says, there we go, right. Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can see that on their screens. So today I'm going to be talking about head trauma, helmets, the benefits of wearing helmets or not in some cases. And if we run down through the sort of things we're going to be talking about, first of all, sort of an introduction into what we mean by a helmet, the types of protection that helmets can provide. It's not always the same. It depends on what you pick and choose and the environment that you're working in. The anatomy of the head, it's always useful to know the geography of the head so you can interpret injuries. That helps you sort of decide whether or not a helmet would have made any difference because they're not necessarily all encompassing around the head. We'll have a look at the tolerance of the head to impact, the sort of metrics which you measure, and the thresholds to various injuries which are built into the performance standards that all helmets are made to. That leads obviously into what protection helmets might or might not have provided in any given situation. And then we'll get into some case studies of the sort of things which we typically see on a regular basis. And then hopefully some questions at the end. If I haven't been particularly clear or we've touched on the subject you've got some more interest in. Okay, so let's start. Introduction, what is a helmet? I know it sounds like a pretty obvious question. Dictionary definition, hard or padded protective hat. It is important it's hard or padded because there are various flavors of a helmet and what they do. Why should we protect the head? Again, sounds like a pretty obvious question, but the head is where all the good stuff is. Sensory, eyes, ears, respiratory equipment, and the obvious one, the brain, that's the one we're most interested in usually. So, different types of helmet. Well, we talked about breathing and hearing and all that sort of stuff. Well, a lot of helmets have got absolutely nothing to do with crashes or anything like that. They're all just there to provide an environment in which your head can survive. So diving helmets, protecting your ears, your face, your eyes, those sort of things. We've got a diving helmet here. But obviously, generally, what we're interested in, and what I tend to see most cases are impact-related injuries. So we're thinking about motorcycle helmets, bicycle helmets, construction helmets, and that sort of thing. Now, there are two different flavors, as I said. We've talked about padded and hard hats. Well, the first protection that helmets tend to provide, or for impact anyway, is to penetration. So they're not really interested in absorbing energy. They're just interested in spreading that energy across your head so that there isn't so much in any one given spot that it's going to penetrate your head. Okay, now an obvious or a common case of this is bump caps. You might have seen them when you go to the garage. Mechanics working underneath vehicles. They're not really very far from the side of the bottom of the car, so there's not going to be a great impact speed, but there's lots of hard, pointy projections which they want to protect against. So bump caps, a bit like a baseball cap with some sort of hard shell inside, but purely to protect against penetration. The other side of the coin is energy absorption. So they're not really interested in penetration. They're just interested in absorbing some of that impact energy. So there'll be structures within the helmet, there'll be foam, there'll be expanded polystyrene or something like that to soak up some of this energy, sometimes permanently, in the case of expanded polystyrene where there's permanent crush. And sometimes if it's foam, then it can happen over and over again. Boxing headgear being a classic example, it would be any good if it only resisted the first punch. But generally, again, we tend to see things which are in the middle. So they protect a bit against penetration, they protect a bit against energy absorption. And these are the ones that we see in our general life. Construction hard hats, bicycle helmets, motorcycle helmets, that sort of thing, climbing helmets, all these sort of things, they're a combination. They're somewhere in the middle. Okay, so in order to understand those medical reports which we get with these cases, telling us what injuries have occurred to the head and where, we sort of need to know a little bit, not as much as the doctors, but we need to know a little bit about what the various structures are in the head to sort of work out where maybe impacts were on the outside of the head, where the helmet was, to see whether the helmet covered it, or whether or not some of these injuries are sort of just related to the brain moving inside the skull. So let's start. So on the outside, we've got the scalp. That's what we see. So skin, hair, muscle. It's that, there we go, it's that red highlighted area on the outside there. And that is obviously over the top of the skull. Now, in relation to the skull, if I can get my laser pointer up here, primarily as far as helmets are concerned, they tend to be interested in the vault of the skull, which is, if you can see my pointer, is this sort of area here. You do get helmets which are full face helmets. You've seen most motorcycle helmets, certainly in the UK, are like that. So there will be some protection down here with the chin bar, but mainly most of the performance standards deal with testing in this sort of area. Okay, so it's these big bones, the parietal, occipital, temporal, and the frontal are the ones that we see most often and the ones that we can say most about. Okay. Okay, so beneath the skull, now we're getting closer to the brain now. First of all, we get to the these three membranes, the meninges. Well, it's more than three, but they're divided up into three sections. Now, the first one, if you're coming from the outside coming in, is the dura mater, and that's actually made up of two different layers, the periosteal and the meningeal layer, but together they're known as the dura mater. And then below those, we have the arachnoid, which again, I've highlighted in red for you there. And then again, below that, there's another one, which is the pia mater. Now, these are useful to know about because quite often brain injuries or head injuries, you heard about subdural hematomas or subarachnoid hematomas, epidural injuries, those sort of things. They are basically describing where that bleeding is and where those injuries are in relation to these layers. So if you look on the left-hand side of that figure, you'll see there's a subdural space, which is obviously below the dura, but above the arachnoid. You've got the subarachnoid space, which is obviously below the arachnoid, above the pia. You'll also probably hear about epidural injuries as well. And that's above, so outside of the dura. And then obviously below that is the brain, which is of a lot of interest to us in general. Okay, so what sort of tolerance does the head have to impact? Well, there are sort of main injury types which you can sort of break down these medical reports into, and I've got a few listed there. Skull fractures, those are the ones that I can say the most about as a scientist and engineer rather than a medical expert. But obviously you also get brain contusions and bruising because the brain moves independently to the skull. So it sort of rattles around inside, and we might see some simulations earlier which sort of illustrate that a bit better. Diffuse axonal injury, I won't really go into that in great detail, but that's more associated with rotational acceleration of the head rather than direct impact towards the center of the head. That's quite tricky to talk about because many of these performance standards, which we'll look at later, predate not necessarily interest in this area, but knowledge about what caused it. So it was very difficult for them to actually build anything into their standards which protects against it. And many helmets don't really provide much protection against DAI. And then finally, hemorrhaging and hematomas, which we spoke about a moment ago, subdural hematomas, subarachnoid hematomas, those sort of things. Now, the data we have in terms of how the head is able to resist these forces is based upon, it's a lot of statistical data, information from hospital and accident records, experimental testing of cadavers, and there has also historically been a lot of testing, certainly in the States, with animal testing. I don't really go into that in detail here. Certainly in the UK, most of it is hospital accident records and cadaver testing. But it's all statistical in nature. We can't really forget that. No two people are the same. Some people might have a thinner bone skull, some people might have a thicker. So when we start talking about thresholds for when things happen, it's typically median values. We're talking about the center of the bell curve. There's always going to be people one side or the other. But we can talk about this sort of 50th percentile in the middle or larger. And that's really where these thresholds are coming from. Okay, so there's two sort of metrics that we use in order to assess the severity of an impact. One of them is linear acceleration of the head, and that's sort of acceleration of the head or acceleration towards the center of the head. So sort of a direct impact on the side of your head like this, for example, rather than at an oblique angle. And also this other one, this head impact criteria. Now that's sort of more interested in what's happening over a period of time. So the speed at which, or the rate at which acceleration or linear acceleration is building up, because it's been spotted that that metric also has a bearing upon the severity of brain injuries and structures within the brain. But primarily, the standards, the performance standards associated with helmets really only deal with linear acceleration of the head. Some of them do deal with this HIC, but most of them are just to do with peak linear acceleration. So as you can see there with linear acceleration, the research in the past, and this is what the standards are built to, have been looking at thresholds for skull fracture. And there's a couple of gentlemen here, Mertz and Alsop et al., back in the mid 80s to early 90s, looked into this in some detail using cadavers and statistical data. And they came up with this threshold, median threshold, for when a skull fracture might occur of 250 to about 280 G, where G is the acceleration due to gravity. It sounds like a lot, but without a helmet, in reality, you only have to drop your head about 33 centimeters from rest onto a hard surface to generate those sort of forces. So you can see it doesn't really take much to reach the threshold for fracture, which is why helmets can be so useful. And as I mentioned, this is to do with peak values as opposed to anything to do with time. Yes, and the head impact criteria, the reason I mention that is because it has been incorporated quite a lot into standards which the automotive industry use. So when they're interested in passengers in cars rattling around inside a car, or perhaps a car hitting a pedestrian and how hard the points are on the front of the car. The automotive industry tends to deal with this HIC metric. They're not really so much interested in specifically the head, so they deal with the HIC, and we might come back to that later on. But primarily I'll be dealing with this linear acceleration today. And this is just really just an illustration to help with what I was just talking about. As you can see there, if I get my pointer out again. Okay, so peak linear acceleration, they're just really interested in what this value is at this point here. Whereas the head impact criteria is specific, well, typically over about 50 milliseconds is what they're interested in. They're looking at what's happening between these 2 points. So all of this, they're interested in that. And there are various formulae and whatever to extract a number out of that, which they then compare to, a threshold, which they're not allowed to go above. So before we move on, I'm hoping we can just show this little video, which will give you some sort of indication of, or like taster of what's happening when you're not wearing a helmet and when you are wearing a helmet. And the way that simulations such as this one can show quite easily that the forces which are occurring on your brain are significantly reduced just by wearing a helmet. Okay. Okay, so moving on to helmets themselves. What sort of protection do they provide? Well, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are based upon research which was done 20, 30 years ago, perhaps. And so on the back of that, they incorporate the research which was done then, not necessarily new information which was found since that time, and they focus almost primarily upon this idea of minimizing the peak linear acceleration because of this threshold that has been demonstrated in relation to skull fracture. Here we've got a list: bump caps, mountaineering helmets, construction hard hats, bicycle helmets, motorcycle helmets. They all have their own performance standards. These are all European or harmonized standards, but you can see they're all BSs as well. So, their validity will carry on from now until such a time as Brexit demands that other performance standards are developed. But these are the ones that we're working with. And there were lots of legacy helmets out there, so these things are still popping up. The legal requirements for using them, though, you can see obviously in a workplace, you've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, and on the road, you have the Motorcycles Protective Helmets regulations. But obvious in its absence is anything to do with bicycle helmets. At the moment, that's sort of down to the choice of the rider. And it doesn't really matter what the highway code says. There's no legal requirement at the moment anyway to be wearing bicycle helmets on the road, which is quite often why these cases appear, because you have an accident where it's not a case of a bicycle helmet not being attached properly or coming off, they just haven't been used, but they're still on the road, still traveling at speed, still interacting with vehicles which can be traveling up to 50, 60 miles an hour. All right, so let's move on to some case studies. I've got two here. I've got one to do with the cyclist, one to do with the motorcyclist, and they deal with slightly different aspects, which are of common interest. So in this case, we've got a cyclist who's on an A road, struck by a passing van, found lying afterwards on the side of the road. He's got serious injuries, fractures to his head, specifically in the occipital area of his skull, which is this area at the back of your head, in the sort of nape of your neck, if you like. Now, just doing a normal sort of reconstruction work, the van itself exhibited all sorts of contact marks, which are of interest. The witnesses behind the van also reported that the van did actually hit the cyclist. The cyclist couldn't remember anything afterwards, post-impact amnesia. But everybody agrees that he wasn't wearing a helmet. He didn't have a helmet with him, and he wasn't wearing it. So the question is, if he'd been wearing a helmet, would that have prevented any of his injuries? Or alternatively, would it have at least reduced the forces experienced by his head to a useful amount, such that a medical expert could then comment on the reduction in the severity of the injuries? So, of course, the first thing we can do is we know how big our cyclist is. We know what his bicycle is. I've been to see him. I know what his riding position is like. I also know a lot of information about the van. I know where all the various bits and pieces are. I know where the marks on the side of the van are. I'll mark them all up here. So we have various marks on the side of the van. And we can marry those up with various points on the bicycle, pedals, and hubs of wheels and brake calipers and things like that. That sort of tells us what the contact is between the man and the van. Okay, it also means that we can sort of offer him up. You notice that I've highlighted the wing mirror in red. And we can also do that from the side. And from the side, we can start building in these marks which are on the side of the van to tell us how close he was, what the interaction is between the two. That tells us where his head was in relation to things sticking out, such as the wing mirror. So we can move him in. That's the handlebars just touching the side of the van, the outside of his leg maybe. And, then the pedals start to interact with the side of the van. So maybe this is sort of where we think he might have been, because we know that there's contact marks, quite an advanced position on the side of the van, probably associated with the side of his bike. And you can see that the wing mirror of the van started to overlap with his head. Rather misleadingly, he's wearing a helmet in this one, but he wasn't wearing a helmet at the time. Okay, so coming back to this side profile again, we can see that, yep, there we go. If we accept the fact that he was close enough in that the wing mirror was going to touch him, looks as though the top of the wing mirror is going to start making contact with the back of his head. Well, we know he's got occipital fractures, so that sort of makes sense. Right, okay, now we want to know what difference a helmet would have made. We think he's been hit at the back of the head by this mirror. Well, here's a dummy, it's wearing a helmet. Here's an impactor. Let's sort of see what happens, just as an example. Okay, so we can see that there's an impact on the back of his head. It seems to hit his helmet. Unfortunately, not all helmets are produced equally. And really the requirements of the manufacturers are a lot more simple than that. And we can really, certainly when there's no helmet available, we can only really comment upon what the minimum that the manufacturers are required to provide. And in this case, I've got two images here on the left. The red area, red and the yellow area show where the manufacturer has got to test. Those are the areas in which the helmet's got to perform. He doesn't have to have, or the manufacturer doesn't have to have helmet anywhere else, just has to have it in those red and yellow areas. Okay, so we stick that over the top of sort of a standard skull. All skulls are different, but we can see that it sort of completely covers the parietal area, most of the frontal area, but it doesn't really cover any of the occipital area at all. That one that we've just seen, yes, it had some helmet back there, but it doesn't have to. And I don't know whether that was the helmet he was wearing. He might have been just wearing a little skull cap. So I can really only talk about that part of his head. I did have a video here of various testing scenarios. Well, we can have a look at that anyway. This is sort of an indication of the sort of tests which the manufacturers have to carry out. Now, you might have noticed at the end there was actually a couple of non-impact tests. In that case, they were actually looking to see whether the chin strap and the chin strap attachments were strong enough and would prevent the helmet rolling off the top of the head, for example. That becomes of much more interest when you're talking about motorcycle helmets, which tend to be a lot heavier. And there's much more opportunity with that situation for helmets to detach. But they also test bicycle helmets in exactly the same way. So it's actually useful to sort of see that when we talk about motorcycles in a moment. Okay, so quickly going back to our bicycle or bicycle rider, we've done all this work. We know where the helmet, what it should be covering. We know what his position is in relation to the van and the wing mirror. So we can put all of that together to sort of see whether or not this wing mirror would have struck an area which we can guarantee would have been tested and should perform to the standards if he was wearing it. Oh, let's go back, there we go. So here we are, we've overlaid all of those images on the top of our rider, and we can see that the wing mirror there is going to strike a part of his head which is not going to be covered by the performance standards of a typical bicycle helmet. So in this case, it's unlikely that these occipital skull fractures which he received, if they were associated with this wing mirror and not his subsequent fall to the ground, we won't talk about that here, but that it was also part of what I was looking into. But if it was associated with the wing mirror, then a helmet, a wearing helmet, was really not going to make any difference. Certainly not to that part of his injury, so his skull fracture. Whether or not it made a difference in other aspects, like I say, when he fell to the ground and brain injuries associated with that, well, that's a slightly different question. Okay, so we'll sort of wrap up now with this motorcycle impact that I've dealt with. Circumstances, motorcyclist driving down a road, car turns across him into a side road, obviously stops the motorcycle, motorcyclist faults the bonnet of the car, lands on the pavement on the far side. But he did have a helmet, but it was lost at some stage during the collision. So the question that I was asked, and it's not an uncommon question, as I'm sure you know, why did the helmet come off? And, you know, what sort of degree of protection would have been afforded if it had stayed on anyway? You know, would the impact have been so great that actually it was beyond the scope of the standard performance standards for that helmet? So really, it wouldn't have made any difference. Well, it wouldn't have prevented an injury such as a skull fracture, for example. Okay, we'll deal with the detachment quickly. First, this is a COST 327 study. That was a European study which looked at a lot of accident statistics from the UK and from Europe. And they reported about 10% of reported collisions involved the loss of a helmet, so it's quite common. And there are lots of different causes: not doing the helmet up, not doing it up tightly enough, having a helmet which is too large, maybe the chin strap failed, or maybe the attachment between the chin strap and the helmet failed. There are more esoteric ones associated with the testing. And this next one to do with the user head profile. Well, tests which are carried out using helmets to make sure that helmets meet the right spec, they're carried out on a dummy head. It's a very crude sort of metal carved head. It doesn't really bear an awful lot of resemblance to what you and I would think of as a head. And different parts of the world, statistically, those populations might have or can have slightly different median head shapes. So where the helmet has come from can be important, because you might have this mismatch between what the helmet was tested on and the head shape of the person who's been involved in the incident. I've got a little diagram here which shows this side profile. The red line is the side profile of the test head. I've got a CT scan of our guy who's come off his motorcycle. And you can see that there are areas there where it would be slightly looser and slightly tighter. This is actually quite a good fit in my opinion. But certainly if he was from the Far East, or certainly from that racial stock anyway, his head shape might be significantly different from a European test head. And there's some others there, if the helmet's obviously destroyed or broken up because the impact is so high, then obviously that's a reason why it might come off. Or there might be other mismatches associated with the linings on the inside of the helmet. Okay, so in our case, we've got our guy. He's vaulted across the front of this car. There's all sorts of impact marks on there to help us out. As you can see, he's sort of come across at a diagonal angle from the bottom, about 57 degrees. He's hit the windscreen. His body's hit the windscreen with his elbow, and his head has hit the windscreen further on. There's another mark there. But because there's also not only that angle, that oblique angle that he's come in at, but also there's a rake of the windscreen, I've got to try and resolve all of those things, because what I'm interested in is the speed of impact perpendicular to the surface that he's come into contact with, i.e. the windscreen in this case. So I've got to resolve all of those things to start with. But then he's continued over the top of the bonnet. He's sort of cartwheeled through the air. And I've followed his center of mass, which is that little red circle with the cross in. And I've got some great sort of dash cam video footage, so I know how fast he's rotating as well, because that's of interest. And we can sort of see he's come over there, how far the center of mass has fallen, which tells me the vertical component of the impact speed with the pavement. As I said, the rotation is important. You could do all sorts of maths, working out whether or not his head was rotating towards the pavement, or maybe it was increasing the impact speed, or maybe he'd passed that point already and his head was rotating away from it, in which case that would reduce the impact speed, and obviously the impact would be on a different part of his head. So wrapping that all up, what does that mean in terms of the questions which we were asking earlier? Well, his center of mass falls about 1 meter, but because he's rotating and it looks as though his head's rotating towards the pavement, that vertical impact speed with the pavement is bumped up to about, in this case, 5.43 meters per second. Now, he had a helmet which was meeting the European performance regulations, ECE R22.05, and the testing which is carried out for that performance standard is about the impact speed anyway of that impactor that you saw coming down and whacking into the bicycle helmet, is 5.5 meters per second in the facial area. So that's the chin mark, because it's going to be for a full face motorcycle helmet. And in all other places over the vault of the skull, 7.5. So that means that impact speeds below those numbers are not going to generate sufficient linear acceleration to go past that threshold for skull fracture. So our number is 5.43. So whether or not he was hit on the vault of the skull, whether or not he was hit on the chin bar, that threshold for skull fracture wouldn't have been exceeded. So our conclusions here really, threshold wouldn't have been exceeded. The chances are those fractures would have been avoided. Certainly, his brain injuries would have been reduced, because just by the very fact of wearing a helmet, that's bringing down those forces and the time over which they occur. So that has a knock-on effect on brain injuries. But that's, again, that's for medical experts to comment on. Okay, so wrapping up, summary. What can we do? Well, we can analyze the biomechanics of these riders to work out what these likely head impact speeds are by various methods, as you saw in that last example. We can compare those with the performance standards for a helmet, so we know whether or not the impact speeds are so far out there that they're beyond the scope of the testing of the helmet, or whether or not actually we can say, hang on, they're low enough. So we can say with a good level of confidence that injuries such as skull fractures would have been avoided. And in general, it just demonstrates that helmets, whether or not they prevent those fractures or those specific injuries which are dealt with in the performance standards, they do reduce the forces involved in these impacts, and that just naturally has a knock-on effect on the severity of the injuries of the brain beneath. But again, at that stage, my engineering report would then need to get handed off to a medical expert. Okay, so that's me finished. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I think there are a couple of questions for you. First one, now you spoke about peak linear acceleration and you said that had been written into the performance standards for helmets. But how is head impact criteria used when assessing the severity of a head impact?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, the reason I put it in there is because it crops up a lot in standards associated with the automotive industry. So sort of the performance of cars in relation to vulnerable road users and pedestrians. We all probably remember well, certainly I do, maybe I'm showing my age there, but some time ago, there was a lot of concern about cars which were appearing on the market with bull bars. Everybody liked bull bars on the front of their SUVs and off-road vehicles. But it was realized pretty quickly that if you have those things on the road, then they're not really very forgiving if you have an impact with a pedestrian. Now, there are various organizations who sort of look into crash testing of vehicles and the safety of vehicles under those conditions. They look at airbags and crush intrusion of vehicles as to whether or not, if you're inside the vehicle, whether or not you're going to get squashed by, the engine being pushed through the firewall. Euro NCAP is very good for that sort of thing. And one of the things that they also look at is they look at this front of the vehicle and how forgiving that is for pedestrians. Now, it just so happens that I have a figure to show you. Here's an example of what the Euro NCAP tends to produce. And you can see what they've done here is they've actually mapped out the front of a vehicle to show where the hard points are and where the less hard, not so hard points are on the front of the vehicle. And they've mapped these out using head impact criteria. They have their own specifically made impactor, a little bit like that one that we saw, which was hitting the back of the bicycle helmet. And they'll mount that up in front of a car and they'll just start pummeling it in a nice little matrix across the front of the car, measuring what the response is of the vehicle, and they'll measure that in HIC. So if I was coming to have a look at a pedestrian, or I suppose most usefully here, maybe a cyclist impact with the front of a vehicle, I would not only just be looking at the speed of impact between the head and the front of the vehicle, I'd also be looking at this sort of map and having a look to see where the marks were on the front of the vehicle, because head impact speed of maybe 5 meters per second on the green area is not going to be the same as a 5 meter per second impact on the red area, sort of in and around the A pillars maybe. So this sort of thing becomes quite useful. So occasionally HIC can be useful, even though it's not actually built into the helmet standards.
And then final question, just before we wrap up, what is the difference in magnitude of the forces experienced by a head with and without a helmet?
Okay, so we talked about thresholds, and the fact that wearing a helmet by its very nature is going to spread forces over the head, and it's going to reduce down the shock to your brain and the structures of your head just so naturally. But we didn't actually talk about by how much, or an example of how much. I've got another figure that I just tacked on the end here because I thought I might need it. So here's a nice little reference. This was actually tests which are carried out on bicycle helmets. And I've overlaid 2 here. You can see on the left-hand side, we've got this linear head acceleration value. Bearing in mind that 250 G is where this threshold is for skull fracture. And you can see if you don't have a helmet, you have this very high peak over a short period of time. In this case, it's hitting about 600 G, but very narrow. Whereas if you're wearing a helmet, the peak value is much lower. In this case, almost 6-fold reduction. It's interesting to note also when we're talking about HIC, where HIC is concerned with how quickly the acceleration increases. You can see by wearing the helmet, essentially what we've done is maybe the area under those 2 curves might be about the same. So the amount of energy is about the same, that makes sense. But we've spread it over such a much longer period of time that not only have we got a lower peak, but also the rate at which it increases is significantly more shallow. So, this is just a bicycle helmet. So you can see there's, serious benefits to be gained from wearing a helmet, even when we've moved away from talking about thresholds. You can see that there's in this case anyway, a 6-fold reduction almost.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Gemma, for fielding our questions. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thanks. It was really, really interesting, and I'm sure we've all come across these arguments and what we have to look at when we're dealing with cases involving head injuries and the wearing or otherwise of a helmet. If there is anything you want to follow up on or us to follow up with John, then please just let us know. Otherwise, I think the only other thing I have to mention is that we have a survey which will pop up at the end of the webinar. It takes less than a minute to fill out, but it helps us to inform us about webinars and what you want to see going forward. So please take the time to do that. And otherwise, just thank you very much to John for your time today. Thanks, Gemma, and thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you.